Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Virtual Alumni Weekend panel discussion 2020. For today's first panel, we're going to be discussing what does civic engagement look like. I'd like to welcome you all, and I'm going to turn the panel over to John Drew, Head of School.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Really glad that we can be here for this is a new feature. I'm really grateful to our panelists for trying something new. What we're hoping to accomplish here is, again, to take advantage of, make the best of this situation where we can't meet in person, but we have a chance to perhaps connect in different ways. And as I think about what we're doing here at the school this year, we're looking for ways to create community in a remarkably polarized time. And I feel strongly that, I will say that community is a word that gets tossed around a lot by independent schools, and want to try to find a way for that to be really to be a meaningful thing here at White Mountain as we work with students. And a big piece of that for me is to figure out what it means to engage meaningfully across difference. And I think there are opportunities for us to help students learn how to do that, opportunities for us to model behavior that sadly seems to be so rare in the larger populace right now. So to start, I'm just going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and just say briefly their name, when they graduated from St. Mary's or White Mountain, and where they're calling in from. Susan, could you lead off?
Thank you. My name is Susan Stout. I was in the class of 1968 at St. Mary's, and I'm calling in from my home in Vienna, Virginia, which is just outside of the District of Columbia.
And Mikaela?
Hi, everybody. My name is Mikaela. I'm a graduate of the class of 2011, and I'm joining in from Baltimore today.
Gail?
Gail Snowden. I am calling in from Palm Beach Gardens in Florida. And I can't remember my class. I think it was 63, but I could be wrong. It could have been 61. I'm not sure.
And Andy?
Hi, Andy Hirschfeld, class of 2011. I'm calling in from New York City.
Great. And Esty?
Hi, I'm Esthefania Rodriguez, but I go by Esty. I am class of 2010, and I'm calling in from Ithaca, New York.
Great. So again, thank you all for being here, and thanks to those who have joined us to listen in. I'll start with a question for Gail. You've said that sometimes individuals need to hold communities accountable. Could you speak a little bit about your experience at the Bank of Boston?
Sure. I think I need to set context, though.
Sure.
That I grew up in a family of civil rights activists who started Freedom House when I was 4, 1949. And so my whole life was really about individuals can make a difference as a key value. And so I was working at the Bank of Boston. I had been there for almost 5 years when I became pregnant. And I realized that there were medical leaves for all kinds of things, but they didn't have maternity leave. And so I decided that this was really important, and I ended up suing the bank for maternity leave benefits. And as a result of winning the case, then the policy changed at the Bank of Boston. I was really afraid that I had ruined my career forever, but that turned out not to be the case because I was there for 35 years.
Thank you. Esty, I was interested when we last spoke that you talked about, in a way that Gail has described, being part of a business community, and part of occasionally there are sort of systems in motion in the places where we either interact socially or go to school or work professionally. And you spoke a little bit about learning to question systems. Could you reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. So just as a little bit of background, so I was born in Colombia, and I am now a naturalized US citizen, but I do consider myself a first-generation immigrant. And I came here when I was 10 with my mom and my two sisters. And I've watched my mother, who I love and deeply admire, go through a lot, from gender discrimination and harassment at her workplace, to barriers accessing healthcare for us and for her, and to living in buildings that were unlikely to be up to code and in neighborhoods that were unlikely to be meeting environmental safety standards. So as a child, I thought this was just the way things were meant to be. But as I became older and watched other people in similar situations here and abroad, I started to realize that things are that way because somebody sometime decided that they should be that way, or failed to consider how those things could affect some of us. And I realized that things didn't have to be that way, and that I could, and in fact I should, question systems. And that often when we do, things can and do change. So I'll provide an example from my own personal life. And this is actually a nonprofit that changed my life. This entity questioned the system on my behalf when I was too young to do it, and carved an opportunity for me, and it changed my life. So I lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey, right outside of Newark, New Jersey, and I attended an overcrowded, underfunded public middle school where most of my peers didn't go to college, and a lot of them didn't graduate high school. But this nonprofit saw the value that we had, and so they intervened and offered us the opportunity to attend private schools, and this is how I ended up at White Mountain. But for that intervention, I'm not sure I would be a lawyer today. So that's an example of how someone or an entity like a nonprofit can question a system and change it. And in my case, it changed my life. But there are other examples as well. So a recent one that comes to mind is the Voting Rights Restoration Coalition in Florida. So Florida is a battleground state, and they previously instituted a lifetime voting ban for people with felony convictions. But in 2008, through a grassroots campaign and through conversations that started with people like us and with friends and family, they were able to pass Amendment 4, which basically restored voting rights to over 1.4 million Floridians with past convictions. And the full effect hasn't been felt yet because there are some barriers, like, for example, people have to pay $1,000 to actually get their right to vote restored. And so they have to make these decisions, right? Do I pay $1,000 to get my voting right restored or to feed my family? But it's still an impressive example of what can happen when we together and individually start questioning systems and do something, and how powerful these conversations can become when the systems do change, whether it's in healthcare or education or voting. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, that's great. Andy, a piece of creating community is bridging gaps between people, and you've mentioned an experience at St. Edward's University where you went working on environmental issues and needing to reframe the discussion a little bit in order to draw more people in. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so after I graduated from WMS, I went to St. Edward's University, as you mentioned, and that's in Austin, Texas. And Austin is generally a very progressive place, but that doesn't represent the entirety of the state of Texas. And I led the Students for Sustainability organization there. When I got there, when I got to school and joined the organization, it was called the Environmental Club. And there was maybe 6 students who were involved in that, and they were not the most involved. And the next year, I reinvented the organization to call it Students for Sustainability, to focus kind of on sustainability as a whole and not just the environmental aspect of that, with a big focus on the social justice and the economics of sustainability, and that presenting it as that in that discussion as approaching sustainability and environmental advocacy is good for social justice and social equity, but also is just good for business. And by bridging that gap and bringing a different group of people together that wouldn't have otherwise thought about this, the organization jumped from 6 people to little over 60 people who were, for the most part, pretty actively involved. And that, ultimately is a very important aspect of addressing some of the issues that we've been dealing with as a society in terms of taking care of our environment, because really, if not everybody's on the same page and dealing with this, we're still dealing with a significant problem. And so part of my effort there was to really bridge the gap, and that transitioned into my career as well. And just generally the kind of stuff that I value.
Great, thanks. Susan, you if you could maybe give a brief intro to your professional experience. I know that you've done work across many different cultures, and so could you talk about that notion of maybe an example where you saw a different culture offering a model of cooperation that was important to you and that you took from that?
Sure, thanks so much. Also, I looked at the attendees list and I saw a couple of former classmates or schoolmates on the list, so greetings to them. Emily Sedgwick and Valley Patterson. So my career really got, its foundation was at St. Mary's, where I was introduced to the history of China by a history teacher who was there during my class time, which gave me a fascination with things Asian and international, which led ultimately to me graduating in Asian studies and going to India as a volunteer in a family planning program, which led to a career in public health, which I practiced mostly at the World Bank for 30 years, working largely on the introduction and operation of large-scale maternal and child health family planning programs. So it was a fascinating career. I worked in many countries. And when I was contemplating civic engagement, I was reminded of lessons that I learned primarily in Indonesia in the early 90s about how to engage. Sort of given that we all feel engagement is important, I learned lessons in Indonesia about how to engage that I carried on to work in many other countries and later in work on HIV/AIDS and so on. And I think I was thinking about it, 3 things that they did in their effort to extend primary health care to rural, hard to reach populations were key. The first was that they started out, particularly in Lombok, which is an island near Bali, but on a very deliberate effort to listen to the community that they were going to be working with, in this case to introduce and trial a vaccine for hepatitis B. In any case, the Indonesians really stressed that we've got to go into these communities and listen to them face to face, which is a second core element. Most people and engagement comes from face to face engagement, and which is why I think that lesson for either being effective in a management position or working to get a change in the regulation for the bike path in your neighborhood is fundamental, that good listening-based face-to-face communication was key. And the third thing I learned from them was how important it was to have a systematic effort to outreach to and engage with the communities who, in this case, were the, quote, target population for a primary healthcare intervention. You can't do that sitting in a room and writing tweets and it's not a reading and writing process, whether you're trying to engage governments at the most senior levels, as I did, trying to persuade Pakistan, for instance, to integrate family planning into their health services. And I was summarily invited out of the meeting for doing so. The point is that face-to-face communication is key to any kind of engagement. So that's what's the most important lesson I've learned, is that you need to start with listening, and that means seeing people face-to-face if you can. And the other is being very focused on core and common objectives, of which there are many more than there are discommon. So I'm fascinated by the contrast between the government of India, which really worked on family planning almost as it was a very draconian, coercive, incentive-based program that emphasized that the reason you wanted to do family planning was for the greater good of the GDP in India. Indonesia, in contrast, started by talking to women and communities and learned that the most important value they had, everybody shared, was having healthy babies. So the whole program became organized around healthy babies. It was positive, it was based on listening, and it was driving at an objective that both the government and the target population held in common.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Mikaela, could you talk a little bit about your path toward working now for a nonprofit and how you feel like that relates to the personal and professional communities that you're part of?
Absolutely. So I actually always knew, I think, inside of me that I wanted to do something that made a difference in the world. So that I feel like that actually started at the White Mountain School with one of my after school sports being working at a daycare, which sounds like a really small thing, but eventually ended up leading to me being an AmeriCorps member after graduation. And I went to a traveling university, and now I'm a master's student of nonprofit management at Northeastern University, working at a national literacy nonprofit called Raising a Reader. And I do board work, fundraising, development, things like that. And I really think that nonprofits play a critical role in making the future more equitable. So for example, I really do think that they fill a gap in the services. So filling a gap in government services that are unable or unwilling to fulfill the need, or businesses that are also unable or unwilling to fill a need. So I think nonprofits play a critical role in really just making the future a brighter place for all, but also like for the environment, for animals, things like that.
Great, thank you. Gail, you mentioned sort of the family business of that Freedom House had been something created by your family, and you talked about circling back to it later. Can you talk about that path a little bit?
Well, I talked about why my time at what was then St. Mary's was sort of a relief from always having to deal with community issues. And, you know, my parents, it was very hard because Freedom House was the sibling that I could never compete with because it always took priority. And so coming to St. Mary's was just a wonderful break for me. I could be a regular teenage girl. I love the academics. And even though while I was at St. Mary's, I was still different, I guess because of my liberal politics, I still had a lot of friends, and it was just such a great time. And so after I went to Harvard, I made the choice to escape the family business, that I did not want to be a social worker. And what was the farthest thing I could do? Become a banker. So that's what I did. For 35 years, I worked at various iterations of Bank of Boston. I want to come back to something Susan said, but I'll finish my thought. So you can't escape your family and your values. So after I retired from the bank, I then went to the Boston Foundation, and I retired from the Boston Foundation. I spent 6 months in Florida and came back to work at Freedom House for 7 years as the CEO. So came back full circle. But I want to think about something Susan said, because while I was at the bank, I was given the opportunity to start up a new business. And it was based on a law, the Community Reinvestment Act, which said that banks had to meet the needs of low and moderate income communities. And most banks took the role of least resistance, to do the least that they could do. But management at Bank of Boston decided that they wanted to see if they could do something different, create a new model. And so they asked me to create it. So at the beginning, it was just myself, my secretary, and they gave me 7 branches to work with. But what I found was, even though if you had a law and you had the support of senior management, it didn't mean you had the support of everybody else that you needed to work with. And so I really learned that you had to create community and you had to create allies in order to be successful. And so We grew it from that 7 branches to, I guess there were 160 branches at the end, and over 1,500 employees. And we became a model in the country and got an award from the White House for our work. But the most important thing to me was creating a space for employees that was committed to diversity and inclusion, including LGBTQ people who always were hidden at the bank. So creating something for employees, creating something for the community that was very suspicious of banks. So I had to do the listening thing that you talked about and engage community at a real basic level and listen. And then figure out how to get partners in the bank to not stand in my way and to help me be successful.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. You know, this notion of sort of starting small and building from there reminds me of a situation last school year here at White Mountain. We had a permaculture field course, so a week-long experience where students learned about permaculture, and there was a local person familiar with that planning who helped out with the course. That person then reached out to the school and said that there was going to be a service opportunity at the local VFW post, which is just around the corner and down the hill from the school. It's only about a mile away. And I took a group of students down there, and the person arranging it was someone who had a veteran from Afghanistan and the Iraq War, who was starting something called Veterans Victory Gardens, and he was trying to get VFW posts and other similar places to just plant gardens as a way to have the members of those places just begin to get their hands dirty and connect with growing things, which he found very restorative. And it was really wonderful. He was vocal about calling attention to the group of people that had gathered to build these raised beds down at the VFW. And he said, you know, in 2019, when would any of us see each other or speak to each other or have any reason to be together? And he said, sadly, there probably isn't any reason why we would ever do that. And now look at us, we're out, you know, working together. And it was such a powerful moment for that reason. And it started, you know, again, on a very small basis. And now his work is growing to a number of places and getting a number of people up here in Bethlehem and Littleton working together. So I think those opportunities are key. I want to reiterate, Scott put something in the chat that if anyone listening has a question for our panelists, to either enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or into the chat, either one. And as you start to do that, perhaps are there other panelists who want to ask? Gail asked Susan a question or referred to something that she had said. Any of the rest of you want to sort of, any crosstalk there that is questions that have come to mind for you? I'll do the teacher thing and be patient with silence.
Well, I just wanted to say, from my time at St. Mary's, I was the only student of color. And so it's just marvelous to see how the school, White Mountain School, has evolved, and that there's a real sense of community. And I've listened to the panelists, and I listened to Isabel talk about her experiences. And it's just a wonderful evolution for me to see. So thank you.
It's great. And Isa and other students bring remarkable, you know, that at this point, the school really isn't complete without every student's presence. And I think our goal is to be sure that every student has complete access to the mission of the school. I'm going to jump in, and Andy, can you talk a little bit about your experience of where does journalism fit into this picture as your work in journalism? Talk a little bit about that.
That's a very good question. So one, this conversation is something that is rapidly evolving, right? And over time, especially, you know, as we've seen in this current political climate, that people are becoming more and more divided. And there is a false equivalency in arguments coming from one side or another. But part of bridging the gap in civic engagement, in my view, is trying to understand where everybody is coming from, because perspectives that are morally objectable, that are radicalized in a lot of ways, are distorted interpretations of a kind of legitimate concern. And through my experience, part of properly addressing those issues is really to take a step back, hear where they're coming from, and then go later and evaluate that relationship with the facts. And you know, I've noticed that there's more of a chance to come to a great solution that is amicable, that is moral, when when people are feeling less attacked. Mm-hmm. And that's, in my view, part of civic engagement. And I think that there's a lot of power here in words and in information that has really changed things. And so, you know, watching some of the developments in social media in a positive way, you know, getting people on the streets protesting, taking on this huge social reckoning that we're facing in our society right now, is something that's coming a lot from some of these social media tools. And so, you know, working through that in the capacity of journalism, you know, really allows us to have a conversation with people who are otherwise thinking differently than us, or not in our echo chambers, or, you know, that wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable talking to a member of the press. And, you know, part of the relationship, and there's a blur and some gray area there, because, you know, as journalists, you know, there's a lot of animosity towards journalists, more so now than in the past, but that, you know, that's largely because our job is to call people out for their inactions or their misdeeds. And so, you know, when a lot of people are approached by reporters, there's some level of skepticism. So coming to a conversation with a certain level of empathy for whoever you're speaking with is vitally important. And, you know, while this directly, it is inappropriate necessarily to offer some civic engagement with the aspect of my direct role as a reporter, it is something that empowers a conversation to happen. And that is monumentally important in my view, in my experience.
Great, thanks. Mikaela, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting what Andy was saying. I think there's so many ways now to be involved civically that are free or that take very little time. For example, writing letters to your senator. And especially now, I know that there's so many websites where you can just put in your zip code and it'll really auto write the letter. So I think, you know, when we talk about civic engagement, we can all be creative in thinking of the ways that we can become involved in our community that are free or that take 5 or 10 minutes a day. So I really encourage everybody to just think of those ways that, you know, they can make a difference in their community that way.
And Mikaela, can you talk about, you had mentioned your grandmother, and said, can you tell the group about that?
Yeah, so growing up, my grandmother had always written letters to the editor, and I thought it was so funny, but it really got me thinking, okay, what are the ways that I can, you know, do what she's doing and write letters about the sidewalks not, you know, up to code, or these buildings, they're making too much noise, or whatever the issue may be. It really got me thinking, okay, what are the small ways that I can become involved in my community now? So it's been really a really interesting experience seeing how we're both civically engaged, but in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. Esty, you have, not only did you go to White Mountain, but you have several siblings who have gone. Do you know from them what was the range of experience along some of this notion of community for multiple siblings across a family? How has that changed over time?
A great question. So I think our relationship with the White Mountain School started back in 2006 when I was a freshman there. And at the time, I was one of 2 Latinos, and there were just a handful of other students of color. And so I cannot even imagine what it must have been like to be the only one. Because even with my experience where I was just one of 2, I remember we quickly became, so he's one of my best friends now. We became friends very quickly because of our similarities, if you will. So that was kind of my experience in the beginning. And then now my brother just graduated from the White Mountain School this past year, and to see that within his class, there's just so much more diversity than there was 10 years ago. So that's one of the big things that stands out to me as a big difference. But I think also in some of the things that the school is doing right now. So thinking about, okay, so how do we help our students of color? How do we help them become more engaged with the community and also with the activities that you have to offer, like the outdoors? I know for me, for example, when I went there, these programs weren't in place. And so it was very hard for me in a way to integrate because I didn't have the money to buy a backpack or to buy ski pants or anything like that. And so nowadays I see that there's a conversation, and it's not just a conversation, there's actual change going on where students are being supported in the different ways that they should be supported so that they can be part of the community that is the White Mountain School. So those are just some of the ways that I see the school has changed in the past 10 years through my siblings.
Thanks.
So we have a couple of questions that have come in that I can share with the panel. The first being directed to everybody on the panel. What have been key influences to shape your values as it relates to civic engagement?
Say it again. What have been key incidents?
What have been key influences that have shaped your values as related to civic engagement? So I read that as whether that was people that were influential in your life, or perhaps a book that you read, or an organization you were affiliated with.
I hate to sound like an advertisement for the school, but for me, I think really, I know this is going to sound so corny, but my interest in others and in working with others and feeling that this was something that was personally motivating really started at the school for me. It was a whole new world for me of basically what happened is I got elected to be the president of the school, and I didn't know that I was even in the running. It completely shocked me, and it sort of I was successful at the job, I thought, or the task at the time. Although at the time, our whole organizing principle as a student body was to be against everybody else, the faculty in the school. It was a very protesting time. But that it was stimulating to me. It turned me on to the idea of working with others to achieve changes. At the time, the changes look, they're so ancient history, but this was when the discussions about co-education were beginning to get underway and so on. So for me, the school itself had, and taking taking up a leadership position there that I wasn't expecting, I think it had a profound influence on my whole career and my whole outlook on life. It was stimulating, it was engaging, and I put an awful lot of what happened to me in my professional career back to that time.
I mentioned my parents, but this was a multi-generational thing. When my mother came to Harvard, she was class of 38, but when she came in 1934, she was not allowed to live in the dormitory. so she had to live with a family. And my Nana was furious. And so she came and she beat on the school. And then my mother was allowed to live in the dormitory. And then my grandfather on my father's side was employed as a janitor at the Boston Army base. And he wanted to become a clerk. And I read his biography and he talked about all that he went through to become a clerk. And he joined the Army and eventually became a colonel in the segregated Army. So, you know, so it was family. But I also would say right now, I think Rachel Maddow is somebody who influences me all the time to become more engaged. I don't think I would have joined with 5 other people and held up signs in Vineyard Haven about separating the children from their parents if I hadn't been listening to Rachel Maddow and Jacob Soboroff about what was happening on the border.
Thanks. Others on that panel? Good.
Well, just for me, and this is going to another odd one, but one of the things I learned early on is that I didn't know early on that there was such a field as public health. It didn't occur to me. I knew there was medicine, but it never occurred to me that there was a whole discipline about how to make a population health better. I'm sorry, I can't remember where I was going with that, but the major point is that learning is a lifelong experience. And if you are willing to be open to trying a different thing. I remember telling my mother I was getting interested in public health and she said, isn't that sanitation? And then you kind of go, yeah, well, yeah, it is, but let's go see what it's the end of that line. And at the end of the line was a really interesting career. My point is that you don't have to separate your quote professional life from your interest in civic issues or in governance or in public issues. You can make public issues your life and you can be successful doing it. It's crude, but true.
Mikaela, you've mentioned a little bit about coming to White Mountain as a day student and how that was actually a significant change for you. And I think, you know, as we talk about these sort of learning about possibility, as Susan just referred to, can you describe that path?
Absolutely. So I was at the White Mountain School only for 1 year and I was there as a day student. So I think looking back, the most pivotal experience for me was the college counseling. So in my public school, there was very little focus or emphasis on going to college or, you know, even folks asking you, oh, what's your interest in after school? It was much more focused on agriculture. You know, there was many women who graduated and just, you know, had very little aspirations, I would say. And so I feel like going to White Mountain School was the first time that I was really in a community where several people expected me to go to college and expected me to graduate, which was really life-changing for me to realize, okay, this isn't something that just happens in the movies. Like people actually are leaning on me and people are actually expecting me to become better than the environment that I grew up in.
Great. I have another question from our attendees. And it reads, civic engagement seems to ebb and flow a bit in our country, but is currently seems to be at a high. Gail, you mentioned your family's connection to Freedom House, and this attendee wonders if you and all panelists might be able to speak to the similarities and differences in civic engagement at the time of your parents and today.
I think civic engagement has come to encompass more issues broadly. And so in my parents' time, it was really about civil rights. I believe a little bit about diversity, bringing people together to talk about issues of race and class. But it's a much broader field now around civic engagement, whether it's around health, whether it's around climate change, you know, still issues of race, of course, and you know, George Floyd and all of that and marching and protesting. But I think it's a much broader field of issues that people are engaged in now. And I think that's a good thing.
Just to jump in, I think I also think that civic engagement is higher now than it's been for the last 30 years. But as an aging hippie and also a boomer who feels somewhat guilt by association for the fact that boomers generation has left things in such a mess. I think one of the things looking back is it's not something you can kind of turn on and turn off. You kind of have to commit yourself if you are going to be engaged it's more important now than ever because there are more issues and because there's more communication that you understand where you stand and are willing to go stand up for those principles. It's more important now than ever, I think.
One thing that's sort of predominant in today's civic engagement is social media. And I just wonder if you could all speak a little bit about that, of the impact or influence that social media has today. You know, many of the news reports I've seen have talked about how it helps people organize, and that can be seen as both a positive and a negative, and that sometimes the connection, because social media is so fleeting or passing, that there really isn't as strong a connection. But I just wonder if you could speak personally about your engagement with social media around civic engagement.
Was that an open question to?
Sure.
Everybody, yeah, jump in, Andy.
Well, I mean, that's a huge part of my day-to-day work as a journalist is understanding the relationship between social media and reporting, but also social media and engagement in the process. And I think it's it's a twofold issue. One, people hear something on social media, and especially on platforms like Twitter, they hear something they disagree with, and all of a sudden there's a news literacy issue. So people often all of a sudden think they're experts on an issue they know very little or nothing about. So on one side of the conversation, there's that, and that can perpetuate some not great approaches to dealing with some of society's issues. On the other hand, as we've seen for several years now, from the organizing protests right now, after post the George Floyd situation and the subsequent instances of police brutality that have this social reckoning, but also the Arab Spring, for example, it has become a great tool for people to organize, and a great tool for people to use to get that message out to people, the general public, and people in positions like myself, who our job is to give a voice to the voiceless. And so I think that there's there are issues that come along with it, but there are benefits, and we are kind of in a state right now where we really can go one way or the other at this point. So there's issues to deal with, but a lot of big solutions to some of society's most systemic problems are really coming to a turning point, in my view, from the people that I talk to on the ground, covering these protests that are going on at the moment, fact-checking some of the president's claims about riots, which are just systematically untrue. 93% of all of the protests are peaceful. So, it's part of helping bridge that messaging gap, perpetuated by this messaging. Not to get political here, but that is part of what the conversation is. So again, it is a positive and negative tool at the same time, and we are coming to a turning point, in my view, with the role that it's used in civic engagement and public dialogue.
I'd like to jump in here too. I think one of the things that I've become most aware of in the last 4 years is how social media encourages me to be in my own white privileged liberal Democrat ex-hippie bubble. And what I would like to challenge the younger generation who are got social media tools and they're much more are much more facile with them is one to for me, the hardest thing I'm dealing with these days is how do I get out of my own bubble in a credible way without having to inflict watching Fox News on myself. And that means that I'm looking for places and opportunities where I can engage with somebody whose view of the world is very different in a polite way and in a face-to-face way. And I don't see that. I think we need civic space that is physical as well as we have social media space where people are arguing, but you can't argue with the same degree of rudeness and snarkiness in a face-to-face setting. And I'd love to challenge the younger generation to come up with places for establishing dialogue, and not only across class and race, but across generations. As I'm aging, I'm very aware that I'm growing further and further away from people in their 20s and 30s. And it makes me fear that my bubble is, it's becoming even more impervious to ideas and change. So how do we physically meet in the public square, I think is a big challenge.
I have something to add to that. I think that, part of the issue with the conversation, especially from one side, really comes with we have to deal with a false equivalency here. Engaging with one side of the aisle, another side of the conversation, requires having some level of understanding of where they're coming from. But to say that, the conversation of one side saying climate change is not a thing and the other saying it is like, that's not the conversation that we need to be having. Like, the conversation should be, how do we deal with it? Like, how do we deal with these problems? In my view, engaging with people who just flat out deny and are not willing to understand factual information for what it is, are, unfortunately, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Part of that is an issue as well. And understanding something as a reporter that I've had to feel like feeling like I'm having to communicate over and over to a lot of people who I talk to is that, one, if CNN isn't covering something and Bloomberg is covering something, or Democracy Now! Is covering something and not another, part of that is that a consumer really shouldn't be getting all their information necessarily from one source. You need to hear different perspectives and understand. And unfortunately, there are some systems in play that are a little outdated. And as an industry, we're kind of dealing with that social reckoning, especially because one side of the conversation is, even if it's biased, they're backing up their information, they're backing up their positions with factual information, and kind of one side is just making things up to back up their points. And I think it's important to say, if you're going to make up your points and back them with things that are not factual, you can come to the conversation when you present factual information. And I think, part of that is saying, like, we're going to accept you for who you are in your position, but we're not really going to foster lies. Like, we're not going to, that's not, part of who we are and what we need to stand for. So, I mean, it is part of, understanding and empathy, but it's also not creating a false equivalency of where we are. In my experience, people have been more you're right. People have been, are a little bit more nice to other people when they have to look at them in the face, and not just, their username on whatever platform they're using. So, getting to that public forum is is incredibly important, and I agree. We can use these tools to start facilitating that conversation. And one of the issues that I've frankly seen and have consistently, and I mean, this isn't just me, but I'm sure everybody sees this, is when somebody sees something on Twitter that they disagree with, the emotions that come out with that, those instant reactions are just, for the most part, really don't help anyone. So sometimes, and I've dealt with this myself in my personal life, is taking a step back, understanding this, dissecting it a little bit, and then coming back to the table with a more understanding and objective diplomatic response. And I think that is something that is very lost in the conversation especially about politics.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. Esty, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, so I just wanted to add one point to what Andy was saying. I think that we, fighting these initial reactions, right? I think that as social media users, but this also applies, with anything you share, just taking a moment before you retweet something or reshare it on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, and just asking yourself, okay, what is this saying? Where is this coming from? And what are they using to back this up? Is there evidence to this? And it's just as simple as opening a new tab on Google and just type in whatever it is that you saw in this post or whatever, and see if it holds water, and kind of being responsible in that way and holding yourself accountable for, okay, I'm only going to share things that I have vetted. And you don't need to spend hours or be a researcher or anything like that to see what it is that you're sharing. It just takes a few minutes. So I guess what I want to say is I would really like to encourage everyone, and I try to do this myself too, before you share anything, just ask yourself, what is this saying? Who is saying it? And is there evidence behind or facts behind it?
Yeah,
I found Facebook to be a great tool for organizing. So I belong to a couple of groups on the Vineyard, because it would be very hard to meet people if you didn't know what was going on. So my Vineyard Facebook groups, let me know when there's a protest or something. And then when I came to Florida, I didn't know anybody, but I was able to join the Women's March because of Facebook posting. So, but like Esty, I check everything out. I do Google it, or whatever that little information thing is, to say, is this a legitimate group? Because now I know there's so many fake ones on there.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Esty, I'm just curious if what your law school experience has been like along these lines. I mean, is there, in some sense, I imagine law education is based on long held and established principles and practices. But I'm curious, is there also sort of a modern, are you getting introductions to working with information in these new ways?
That's a great question. So somebody asked about key influences that shape our values as they relate to civic engagement. And for me, of course, one of these key influences has been my law school experience. And I've found that, at least in the context of social media and data, the truth is, my experience, at least my impression is, we don't know how to deal with this situation as lawyers and often as regulators, right? So I know right now, for example, Twitter, they started to kind of pull back some things that may cause misinformation, whereas other platforms, did I get that right? One of the social platforms is pulling back things, and others are kind of just leaning back. And there are these First Amendment arguments about, you shouldn't get to censor me because I have a First Amendment right to express myself, and so those are things that I think, from my experience in law school, we've definitely had classes where we kind of think about these issues, but there are no answers, right? And so my impression is that it's a new field. It's an interesting field. It's an important field, because the way I see it, in my own personal opinion, is, yeah, we of course have these First Amendment issues, here, but there are a lot of other things too on the plate that we need to think about. And when you're sharing misinformation, you are potentially infringing on somebody else's ability to stay safe, because maybe they do believe whatever it is that you're sharing, and they'll take something that wasn't vetted by the entity that's supposed to vet things, and you will hurt yourself. So there's just so much to think about, and it's definitely a growing new field. But my impression is that in the law, at least as a law student, we have to think about these things, and we don't have answers yet because it's so new in a way. But in terms of other types of civic engagement, my law school education has been really great. So we have clinics where as early as your second year of law school, you are put in a team with lawyers and community partners, with often nonprofits, and you are working to help different communities, whether they're women or children or immigrant communities or whatever. So it's just a really good hands-on experience. But there's also like another part of it, which I think is very interesting, which is I studied at Cornell Tech for a semester, and we were trying to think of ways to create applications for your phone, like the ones that you download on the App Store, that could help certain communities. So for example, the group that I was working with, we were thinking about creating an application that would help people understand what are some things you should think about if you're thinking of getting a divorce. And it was meant to be used by people who are in, let's say, unfortunately, domestic violence situations, and they're afraid or don't know how to seek legal help or understand their rights. And so we're trying to create these, trying to use technology to leverage this legal expertise without, practicing law. So it's just been an interesting field. And to answer your question, in the context of social media and information and what's going on right now, I think that we too are a little, we don't know what to do, but we're thinking about it.
Great, thank you. So we're just about out of time. I'm again so appreciative that panelists, you've all joined. And while Zoom isn't actually social media necessarily, here is a multi-generational discussion that we've had. So I think we've tried to make the best of unusual circumstances. I hope in the future maybe we could all be physically on campus here at White Mountain. It would be remarkable to recreate this group and include others as well.